Welcome to the Early Years Scotland podcast, where we chat with people from the world of early years about the many factors that influence children's development from birth to 5 years and how we play a part in giving children the best start in life. Our role as a leading early years organisation is to provide support through our 4 strands of work: working directly with young children and their families, membership and support, professional learning, and advice and advocacy. Let's get started. Hello, listeners, and a big hello to Jim Taylor. Welcome back to this part 2 of our Early Years Scotland podcast, discussing autism in the early years. Hello, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you, Michele. Thank you for inviting me back. It was really enjoyable the last time, so.
It's great. It's more the thought of it, isn't it? Podcasts become this abstract thing, and you say, yes, we can record a podcast, but we come here and it's like, right, okay, heads in gear. We're going to create something.
I love this. Every day's a school day, but 2 years ago I didn't know what Zoom, Microsoft Teams or podcast actually meant, but I'm learning all the time.
Actually, and interestingly, we have the podcast available in audio and in video, and the stats from the previous podcast have shown people like to also watch a podcast, really? Which we think is quite interesting.
Oh, good. I prefer to. I prefer that too. I've had my hair done just for the occasion.
Perfect. So. We like to cover all angles.
Good.
So since we've last recorded, for us, the title of this, Autism in the Early Years, I actually think might be quite a good starting point for this, because we know that early years covers such a broad age range. Yeah. And for us in early years, it's very much about the early level. So for many of our listeners will know absolutely that goes up to primary 1. Yeah. So when we talk about the early years, we are very mindful of guidance we have in place. We have to think about children as they transition into primary 1. So your experience is so vast, and as we chatted earlier, you know, it's almost you, and doing this podcast, you switch your brain to early years, because you've shared before, you work with adults, you work with, you know, young children. So I think actually what would be great for the listeners to think then, for you going to support a setting who are preschool children with a view to moving up to primary 1, could you even just give us some examples of any experiences in the past of advice that you've given to practitioners around that transition? I
think I maybe talked before about seeing really exceptional practice, and the thing that hit me about early years was that people either didn't have the opportunity or didn't take the opportunity to actually dig really deep down into what they were doing about it. And I think for me, the whole thing about transitioning is really important, and quite often I think we get locked into what transitions mean, whereas I think if you have an autistic brain, transitioning from one thing to the next, the whole executive functioning bit is really, really important. And I see really good practice where what excites me about early years is that when good practice is happening, very, very young children are having these things addressed very early on, so that, as I think I said before, I'm working with 15-month-olds right up to 62-year-olds, and in early years we're not having to unpick a lot of difficult things that have developed in the way that we have to with older people, but I think with older pupils and students. But I think it's about, I've had a few really good conversations in the last month or so about that concept of how you teach transitionings. There is that, I was going to say understanding, but there is that belief that autistic children and neurodiverse thinkers don't like change, and I reject that quite a bit. And I think what we do need to look at is how we're actually teaching transitioning from one thing to the next. So you mentioned the transitioning into P1 and beyond. I think there are opportunities from day one to be teaching youngsters how to transition from outside to inside, how to transition from one member of staff to the other, how to transition from parent or carer to member of staff. And I think it helps me to think about the concept of transitioning, the verb. And I've had a lot of really nice conversations in early years, again in the last month or two, with people about that. The one or two practitioners have picked up on saying, we think of transitions as the big ones. And even if it's the big one between, a Play-Doh activity and an outdoor activity, they think of transitions as a thing. And of course that's actually true, but as practitioners it's maybe helpful to think of how do the other 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds, how do they develop transitioning skills? So I can go into that for a while, and probably undoubtedly would. But I think it's that thing where in an early years setting recently, I said, how many transitions are you doing in a day? And they said loads, about 6 or 7. When in actual fact, in the space of 15 minutes we were talking about, we'd identified about 15 or something. That's me exaggerating, but it was that thing. And there was a wee formula we used about transitioning from one person to the next, which happened 2 or 3 occasions, from one child to the next, from activity to the next, and transitioning from a sing-song to a noise in the corner to the cars outside and everything. So there was one particular practitioner who got right into this, and it was really a light bulb moment. They said we really need to start being aware of how often the wee girl is transitioning. So I think that's a useful thing that people are worthwhile. It's worth people looking at it. So that's been something that's been happening in the last month or 2 that's just come back up again.
No, that's great, and that really aligns with Realising the Ambition, which has a section called Transitions that talks very much about horizontal and vertical transitions. So that's really powerful actually, because then that use of the verb can completely change.
Sorry, I'm interrupting. It's been a thing that, as I think I said the last time, I'm actually just using early years to teach myself stuff, that I didn't know, and the staff are able to tell me things like that. And the other big debate has been about free play and free movement and all these different levels and so on. But I just felt it was, on 1 or 2 occasions, it was just making a little tweak to people's thinking, but also to move on from transitioning and neurodiverse thinking and so on, to actually give people the backing that the autistic brain perhaps maybe wired in a different way. And those transitionings, that's me turned a verb into a noun, but those transitionings the 2 and 3-year-olds are picking up in any case, whereas some members of staff said we're seeing progress when we're directly addressing it. So it's not just, as we said the last time, a delay in how they're developing that, but they're coming at it from a different way. So it's interesting.
So many things there. I'll come back to the fact that you're referred to speaking, working with children from 15 months, because I think listeners, that would be intriguing. But I think, could I ask first, in relation to those transitioning, that different lens for practitioners, if you were to give support for an individual who has thoughts around a child perhaps come to neurodiversity as well, or a child who may be autistic, in relation to sort of observations then, because if you've just acknowledged that in the space of 15 minutes or a few minutes there are 15 examples of transitioning, for a practitioner that could be quite overwhelming, because suddenly we've opened up can you observe a child and see how they cope with the move from snack to wherever. So suddenly with your insight there, suddenly it's like, as an individual I've got to be looking at that child when they're doing this, that small thing. So if you were to advise someone who's tuned into this and thinking, gosh, transitioning, right, okay, there's loads in a day, where do I start to try and focus my observations? Yeah,
that's a really good one. I'm going to get a bit pretentious here. I'm a huge fan of an American writer called Charles Bukowski, and last night I read something and he said his advice to people was shut up and enjoy the view. And I think its relevance just now is about observing, because I think to try and develop these transitionings and transitions, we're trying to do something to the children, whereas I think if you observe long enough and watch, and again you guys are more experienced watching young ones, and I think through observations, how you go about doing it is I think 2 things. You watch it when it's working really well, and when it's working really well, it might be, for want of a better word, habit. I've said before about using the autism as a strength, using the neurodiversity as a strength. So I was seeing it working really well when there was a part of the day, whether it was meal times or Play-Doh times, where it just happened really well. I think the other thing that I'm still working my way through with early years staff, and I'm asking them more questions than they're asking me, is that through my observations of the child who struggles or may respond differently to the transitions, the phrase I used was that one activity was bleeding into the other, which is a good thing, and it's a thing you want to encourage, and it leads to perhaps you and I multitasking. But I think for the very young autistic child or neurodivergent thinker, the transitioning is a difficulty because the transitioning is better when one activity has a very clear end, and it's irresistible that that's done and I'm moving on to the next thing. So there's a lot of wee things that you can pluck that down. I don't think that has to be forever. But I know one or two members of staff have talked to me about saying when we've made it a clear end, when we've put the jigsaw away, or when we've put something in a Tupperware in a cupboard with the door shut, he's transitioning better. Now, that's not a top tip for people working with autistic kids. And people have thirst for top tips. Where I'm coming from is that if you want to transition into the next step, make sure the previous step is different. And again, another example is when they were handing over, the simple thing that you'll know better than me, but when you're handing over from mum or dad to the practitioner, it's always better if mum or dad actually disappears, rather than hangs about and watches and so on. And in a recent nursery, member of staff told me how difficult it was at the end of the day when the parents appeared in the playground. And they see that from a behavioural point of view, but I think it might be useful to see it as the transitioning point of view. So making that, it's that absolute clarity that I think is really important.
Oh, again, you say things and then I was going down one road to bring it back and then I go down a different road. That's what I love about this conversation.
Oh, podcast number 15, we'll maybe get somewhere. But I think I'm very wary of giving top tips. What I try to do is say to people, this is how I perceive it, this is how I'm thinking about it. And, if you and I have big transitions and big changes in life to make, you do it step at a time.
Yeah.
And, big changes in our life, if they're not clear,
Yeah, gosh, it does apply. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. We do love a top tip, and something we pride ourselves on in our professional learning. We've said this to yourself in the past. We love to give practitioners that, try this. Here's something you can go and do tomorrow, today. And that might be a sentence, it might be something concrete, a strategy. So I guess taken from what you're saying is really good, that we shouldn't be, it's not one size fits all. It's
not. I think the individuality of the young people that I'm seeing around the place reminds me yet again that, I was chairing an online conference yesterday and there were magnificent top tips. Some were breathtaking. I'm writing them down. I think, right, I'll steal that. I'll see if I can use that in the podcast tomorrow. I'll tell you when I'm doing that. But the voice at the back of my head said, that would fit for him and her. But it wouldn't work with the other person. So I think it's about, I think we need to go a wee bit deeper and say there's a top tip. That works with perhaps the majority of 3-year-olds with an autistic diagnosis. But maybe we need to go deeper and think, why does it work? What's the thinking behind it? And this is where, I didn't know today I was going to be talking about transitioning, but that's where, I love working with early years, because saying to a practitioner, maybe think about transitioning, so it takes away from the behaviour, takes away from everything, and just looks at, see why you did that there and then. Mm-hmm. So it's about changing people's thinking, because this is a highly qualified staff group who continue to blow me away with their insight. But it's just about giving them, as I think we said the last time, giving them permission not to be, in fear of the experts and autism and etc., but just trust their own basic assessment capabilities.
Yeah,
So,
and that is so fundamental. It's something we completely believe in.
yeah,
And I've acknowledged in previous podcasts as well that a sector that's so busy,
yeah,
so up against it in relation to, ratios, etc. And then peppered into that is that, just as you've acknowledged, that fear, of will I get it wrong if, or that desire driven by trying to get it right all the time for all children in the absence of the diagnosis. So I think that what you're sharing is really useful for staff who are working with young children who don't have that diagnosis yet.
Yeah.
And I think that's where staff are seeking, some sort of insight, some wisdom, because it's almost, as we've talked about in lots of conversations, previously personally, the label. We've explored that getting the label can have such positive impacts for children and families, but for others it's not the way it would be. So I think that summarising those last points, it's like having the confidence, having the belief in what they see, and then not trying to say that. Your example I keep going back to now in my head is the the avoiding the bleeding and the transitioning, so putting the jigsaw away, but that might work for for John. That's this is finished now, and let's move on. And that might be John who has a diagnosis, or John who doesn't. So it's how do we get
it's
right?
a really interesting one, the jigsaw one, because I saw two children in the same nursery doing two entirely different things. Let's say John, he needed to have things finished. So when he came upon an unfinished jigsaw, he would do it, have a look at it, put it in the box, put it in the Tupperware, it needed to be finished. And I will say, the day after I saw him doing that, I was talking to a 62-year-old man who was telling me that he was in a bit of a trouble at his work because he refused to leave until the workshop was actually spick and span and everything was in its place. So it was the same thing, to tell his boss, just give me the keys, I'll do it this way. Same thing. 60 years apart. In the same nursery, there was a wee fella who did the same thing with another jigsaw, and I noticed that he would walk past it 4 or 5 times to have a check at it. So he wasn't finished with it. He liked the picture. So this is where the top tip doesn't come in. It's what's actually going through the minds. And I think the issue about the expertise in autism is that you can Google it, you can read the books about it and whatever. And I just think that in a busy profession, it's just about, it's sometimes about asking the question, what bit of the autism or neurodivergent thinking is affecting him just now, there and then? And it's not autistic kids like to finish things. It's John feels really safe and happy with a closure of some sort. So therefore, I'm just going to adjust something simply. Is that addressing the autism? It's a starting point. And and every time I've seen progress being made at any age, it's been that small incremental thing. Because we don't make, I think what we do in education is that at that point they can learn that, they've learned that, therefore they can learn something else. Whereas maybe at the beginning of learning for autistic people, it's one thing. And I don't know if I said to you before, but speaking to another man in his 60s recently, I was again blown away by the fact that he has said, I am the world's greatest monotasker. So when I'm doing something, nothing exists. Even to the extent of he was working on an activity that had a finish point, and when he went to bed it was 5:30 in the morning. And when I said, weren't you tired, weren't your eyes strained, didn't you get fed up, did you need to go to the toilet? And he said, no, I was doing that task. So again, that's not what autistic people do, but that indicates where in the spectrum does this wee guy that has to finish that activity task. And the other, sorry, Michele, just to say, on the same day, I watched a member of staff gathering the children and doing some songs and stories. And that was one of the periods in the day the wee fella, let's call him John, was perfect because it had a clear start, a clear purpose, a habit, and that it happened at the same time every day, and a clear end. There was an end song. So no one had actually sat down and said, why is it working for John? But that time, Play-Doh time, lunchtime, all these things. And it maybe was because it was a clear end. And staff said, when he leaves there, he always goes to that station.
So the evidence in their observations was there, so they were reaching that conclusion themselves.
Yeah.
And I think the example you took there about you're adding depth to the observation, not just that said John, likes to, it's a habit. And I think what I'd like to return to is habits, good habits, bad habits. Have you come across, kind of language around he has a bad habit of doing?
Yeah, and a lot of the language continues to be about, in education, we don't want people to get set in their way. We don't want people to get into habits, and we don't want them to do the same thing at the same day. And I can understand that. There's 2 points to that. We all have habits. People have working days. People have things that they do on a Saturday. I actually have something called Spaghetti Friday on a Friday night. I cook spaghetti and drink a bottle of wine. So that's my habit. But I think people, and there is this thing about, autistic kids don't like change. So we break into that. But what if we can use it to begin with? Because as we've said before, as we say everywhere we go, the secret is making... The golden key is about making that connection with the child. And if I again move into examples of working with older people, I've had a fair bit of success in the last couple of years with adults. And I asked a young man why it was he was engaging with me, and he said, because you keep turning up. And it was 9 o'clock every second Thursday. Or it was 11:15 all the way on a Friday all the way through lockdown, and it became a habit. And one young man I know, was getting up and getting dressed, ready to go, because it was the same time. So my whole thing is, can we use it instead of worrying about the autistic child getting locked into habits and routines and rituals? Can we use it? Because we impose habits on them anyway. Don't tell me you don't, because school starts at 9 and finishes at 3. So we should maybe say to teachers, well, because you're used to working from 9 to 3, next Tuesday we're working from 2 in the afternoon to 10 o'clock at night. That's me going to get hate mail again from teachers. But, we acknowledge it. And I again, sorry, I'm going on about stuff too much, but if we are having to teach something like resilience comes when you feel safe. So there might be some days that's exactly the same. I have a colleague down in the northeast of England, Bishop, near Durford or something, I can't remember the name of the place, and she talks about teaching the children how to deal with surprises and unexpected things. And she starts from a very, very timetable. This is a primary, secondary school, a very, very, very tight timetable. And then they have surprise Wednesday or something, so the kids come in expecting something unusual to happen. So it is that thing about, the routines, the rituals, or whatever, obsessions, whatever inaccurate word you want to use, is maybe the starting point for us.
Great, lots of things there. I'm sure the listeners will be taking, depending on where they are in their journey. Going back then, you said about working with 15-month. I have no doubt that some listeners will be listening, their ears will have pricked and thought, right, okay, so at 15 months, what am I looking for? If Jim's was brought into,
you mean pre-diagnosis?
Yes, pre-diagnosis. What would you...
It's a really interesting one, because the whole concept of pre-diagnosis is I think, a big issue, a big factor in early years. And again, the problem can be we don't want to put them forward. There's a 15-month waiting list. We don't want to start talking to parents. Parents don't want to start talking to family and so on. And I think quite often I get asked the question, should we begin this route? Now, that's not my role to say that. And, I tend to have the very glib answer of saying to staff and parents, go with what you feel about it. But in the meantime, I think if there is a commonality that people have a common concern, which is the lack of I think it is effective contact, but it's the lack of contact. And again, I've learned from early years colleagues that when young people walk through the door, who might be from single families, who might have very little contact in any different way, and I remember saying to a staff member down in Kilmarnock, these children who are responding differently, when can you expect? And she said, by about Christmas, sort of concerns have gone. If you're talking about attachment, talking about single parents, talking about lack of social experience. But the staff who have, the young people that people have concerns around, it's usually about lack of making friends, lack of socialising, lack of interest and whatever. And I think it wouldn't be my place to say start looking for a diagnosis. And my concern is often staff and parents say, well, we don't want to do anything different until we get the diagnosis. And what I'm saying to people and what I'm saying to families that I'm seeing at home is that that's something that becomes really clear. In the meantime, you might want to focus on those issues that might be pertinent to autism and might not. And those issues might be, have a real think about the sensory responses, and mums and dads carers can do that by just watching the child. And a lot of parents will say to me things like, we can't go anywhere with fluorescent lights, we can't go into Sainsbury in case a big bing bong comes on, that's a technical term, bing bong, tannoy or whatever. So they're very much aware of that. So I would suggest that parents and staff look at the sensory thing always. I think the interaction and connection with other children and staff, and I think the language. And there's the three things that probably are going to come up in the diagnosis. But you'll tell me that if a child doesn't get a diagnosis, those are three areas that if you can come to a better understanding of, you're going to make progress in any case. So I think I'm fairly certain in the last podcast we talked about making that connection with the child. And I'll unashamedly go on about that again, because when I'm asked about the prognosis, it's where I'm seeing parents and siblings and peers and staff member going that extra yard to teach the young person that it's fun and helpful and makes you feel safe working with other people. So I think that's the important bit, and I think that's where you can look back to your training and experience without thinking, well, hang on a minute, they might be autistic, I might have to do something entirely different. And I can hear colleagues in the autism world throwing things at me at the minute, but I think that whole thing about that connection you make, which is close to being the golden ticket for early years staff, isn't it?
Absolutely.
You make that, you're the first person out with the family, maybe the first professional that starts. And when I see it happening, it's outstanding, and that tends to be diluted as the young person goes through school. But that's I said diluted, I didn't say diminished, because there was a question came up yesterday and I wanted to say to the person online, I'll take you by the hand to a couple of secondary schools I know fairly close by here, who are brilliant at making the connection, giving respect, giving understanding and so on to 17 and 18 year olds. So
as just to reiterate, your thought connections, it's core to early years, from staff who work with their youngest babies. The eye contact is that first point of connection, in everyone.
It is, and I think, sorry Michele, I think for me the bit that I get a bit uptight about is that it is core to all your training, and I just fear those members of staff who say, oh, hang on a minute, it might be autistic, what do I need to do differently, what am I doing wrong, I need to go on a training session. And I know it's really glib and crass to say go the extra mile, because you're always going the extra mile or the extra yardage or whatever, but lots of tiny wee things where maybe the eye contact and maybe the nursery rhymes aren't the first point, but maybe it's about getting in through a different way. It's the ramp again, isn't it? How do you get there? You might have to get up in a different way, but that end result still remains the important thing. And my perception these days is I could have made a number of statements today speaking to someone talking about 50 to 60 year olds. I would just change bits of my language, but it's still the same thing. How do you make that connection? So I think it's about, for early years, it's about saying to staff, get some training in autism and open up discussions about autism, but don't allow the possibility of the diagnosis to de-skill you.
Yeah, and it goes back to that confidence and fear of getting it wrong. Yeah. So if that message is, loud and clear for anyone, is that the relationships, the connections, they are the building blocks. There's no one listening here from early years who don't appreciate that. But as you say, it's that worry about, how that progresses when you think perhaps the child is, but the ramp applies.
It does, and I think that the knowledge is there, and this is where I think Early Years Scotland has a role to play in terms of its training and professional development and so on. Watching a deputy head who in the space of 5 minutes was 4 different communicating people, demonstrated 4 different communication styles. With the wee guy here, she never sat face to face with him, because he responded really well to language, but not sort of physical interaction. Perhaps he was a monotasker, whereas with other kids were climbing all over her and she was talking and joking and whatever. So it's about capturing these members of staff and saying, how do you do it? Why is it working with you? And again, that's the bit that we spend all our time sitting down at emergency meetings working out why is it going wrong and what we can do about it. And we never sit down at 3 o'clock and say, my goodness, we're not having a single bit of problem with that wee guy. What are we getting right?
Oh, absolutely. Gosh.
And how is autism impacting on him, and where are the advantages? And this is where, habit's a strange word. Habit can be a dirty word to some people. But it's, there's a wonderful book called Atomic Habits. Don't ask me the name of it, I can send you the details. Salt and Waterston's today, so it's fairly current. And it's such a good book. One day I intend to read it. I just keep picking at it and stealing bits from it. And it's about, changing habits or turning habits into positive things and so on. And I think early years staff are particularly good at that. Your first question about how that happens in school is a really interesting one, because there's that maybe more structure or habit or whatever. Don't know.
Oh, I think we've gone down a really interesting path, but that
we
was
hadn't intended.
We hadn't intended going down. But I think for our listeners, I truly believe what they've heard loud and clear is really positive advice. And I think it was lovely how you've seamlessly brought it back to the start of the podcast. And I think your last messages were about the get it right. Early year staff do get it right. So I think just to sort of round up, this part 2 of this podcast is that strong message. The sector, please believe that you do get it right, and their children benefit from that. So hearing what you're advising helps even more.
I think that what I would want to say is that, I've been working with autistic people for over 40 years, but in the last 3 or 4 years, I'm the one doing the learning from staff. I've always learned from people with autism, and my frustration that I think sometimes comes through is that I come away from an early years centre and I think I've learned more than they've actually learned. And that's one of these things that people like me say, but people should say, let's sit down and pool our knowledge and not be afraid to look at wee Johnny instead of looking up a book on autism. The training in autism should be actually giving people confidence in their own thinking, but maybe giving a wee tweak here and there. So hopefully that's been helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jim, as ever. An absolute pleasure. And yeah, I've learned again, it always just deepens my knowledge, which I always think's wonderful. As you say, like, I love to keep learning as well. So thank you for that. We do, for our listeners, we do have an online course around autism, which might be a great starting point for the sector if they have got a chance to develop further. But yes, from Early Years Scotland, a huge thank you, Jim, and over and out from us.
Always a pleasure.
Take care, everyone.
Thank
Bye
you.
for now.
Bye-bye.
Thanks again for listening. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. If you want to get in touch, please email us at info@earlyyearsscotland.org. Take care and bye for now.